Well, there had been guerrilla activity in Iran, at least a little bit, since 1970. And there were assassinations going on. In fact, they killed 3 Aramco employees while I was en route to Iran in July. But the Shah seemed to be reasonably in control. He had started a new political system there called the Khastakhiz, or Resurgence Party. The idea was you'd have one party, but different views could be expressed in the party. The impression I got from the Iranians when I showed up and on until I'll tell you in a minute, was that people were willing to give this a try and see if it would work. That they were very pleased with the economic development, which was going full boom. You know, there were problems. There are in any country where you have that, but that the police was reasonably effective. The army was, you know, quite a powerful army, military force in that area. And this went along pretty much the same way for the better part of 75 and 76 and even on into 77. But what happened, and we began to see this, I think, before others, and that's not uncommon, but people picked up on it, was that the economy went down. And so there began to be a lot more unrest with what the government was doing.
You know, the failure to pay enough attention, particularly once big demonstrations started to emerge, and they began really at the beginning of 1978. The U.S. should have been paying more attention. Secondly, as it became clear in, say, August, September 1978, that the foundations of the Shah's regime were crumbling, the United States should have, or it would be nice if they had, more quickly pushed the Shah to liberalize, to open up. He appointed Shapur Bakhtiar prime minister, I believe it was in early January 1979. If he had done that, say, in September 1978, things might have gone very differently. Or if he had allowed religious forces to act more differently, you know, to act more openly or come into the political system or organize political parties, things might have been different. If he had held back the security forces, particularly in a couple of key times when they shot a lot of demonstrators, if he had had them show more restraint, things might have been different, and the U.S. could have pressured him to do so.
I had been there in 73, 74 and gone all around the whole country, too, so I got some idea of some of the dissatisfaction. I should say that, you know, revolutions are a strange thing. Some people have written afterwards as if people were in a revolutionary mood, but they were not telling people and they were keeping it hidden. But I think a lot of people weren't in a revolutionary mood until the revolution started. I think they build upon themselves, you know, that there was some group, you know, who was starting it. But I don't think Khomeini expected it to be as successful as it was from all indications. And I think people were sort of grumbling and such, but that it wasn't the case that the mood of the people was such that they were thinking, oh, I really want to participate in the revolution. I think they got caught up as it started.
The world radically changed in 1979. I mean, even independent of the Iranian Revolution, you had the start of an Islamic century. You had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which ultimately showed that a small sort of religious power could in fact challenge militarily a superpower and win. So the whole way the world was being perceived changed, and one key piece of it was the Iranian Revolution. So sort of nobody knew how to deal with this. We didn't, the Russians didn't. So the world radically changed in this very critical year of 1979. And I don't think anybody has totally yet recovered from that and found a path to deal effectively with this, you know.
During the presidency of Jimmy Carter, the United States began to show a growing regard for the human rights practices of its allies. Carter was convinced that American foreign policy should embody the country's basic moral beliefs. In 1977, U.S. Congress began to require human rights reports on countries receiving American aid.
In the late 1970s, particularly in 77, the new Democratic administration was pursuing a very active human rights policy. And that we saw a number of things happening in some of the other countries, including in Latin America and so on and so forth. You know, because of this policy of democratization, and that, you know, their unintended consequences was also not very welcome by the U.S. and the West. My only understanding is that neither those people who, I think, you see, the situation in Iran in '78 was very fluid. And the role of particularly the more, what shall we say, nationalist, liberal opposition was crucial in this regard. I think the Shah moved a bit late to reach out to them. And so by the time he offered the premiership to Sadiqi, who was a Mossaddeqist, he refused. At that time, Bazargan and others decided, instead of making a deal with the Shah towards a much more what we call constitutional monarchy, they decided to go with the revolution.
Remember, it's important to realize that Carter ran on a foreign policy platform which had two elements. One is no arms sales to dictators, and two, human rights internationally. Well, it turns out that the Shah of Iran was the largest purchaser of American arms. So when Carter is talking about no arms sales to dictators, who the hell could he be talking about? And number two, international human rights. That was the time when huge numbers of organizations were protesting human rights violations in Iran. So the Shah of Iran heard this and said, that's me. This guy is talking about me. He's not talking about the King of Saudi Arabia. He's not talking about Ferdinand Marcos. He's talking about me. And so I thought I was in good with these Americans, and all of a sudden, this guy becomes president of the United States, and that's his deal with foreign policy. So, no, I'm really nervous. And then Sullivan comes in, and he's part of this whole thing. I mean, he doesn't understand what he's saying. So it wasn't like a conscious decision to undercut the Shah.
The larger view of the Iranians is just a sense of being a country that should have more control over its own destiny, that should be a powerful country, and has been constantly faced superpower meddling, be it. And they could go back even before the United States, go back to the British, they go back to the Russians, they go back to the Ottomans or whoever within, say, the last 200 or 300 years. And it's always a major outside power that's imposing its will on them, at least from their perspective. And there's some truth to that. So I think their view is maybe a little bit more of the sense that the United States is now the major superpower. We have a lot of say. They tend to think maybe more power than we actually have to influence events. And so their lack of